Snow came down in a hush, as though the heavens themselves meant to soften the harshness of the west. The train hissed its last breath against the platform, steam unfurling like ghosts in the night. Clara Mayfield stepped down with her small leather case clutched tight, her gloved fingers stiff from cold. She had imagined this moment differently, someone waiting with hope in his eyes. A man who had written her letters with promises of new beginnings. Instead, she found only strangers, their faces hidden under the brims of their hats, their gazes quick to dismiss her. The wooden planks beneath her boots groaned, and the snow fell heavier, settling into the folds of her shawl like a chill determined to stay. She asked the conductor if her intended was here, reading out the name carefully, but he gave only a weary glance and shook his head. "This ain't your stop, miss. You must have got off one station too soon." The words landed like a blow. Her heart tightened, not with surprise but with shame, as though destiny itself had tricked her. Around her, townsfolk lingered, whispering behind scarves and gloves. One voice carried on the wind, sharp as a needle, a mail-order bride left behind. Clara turned her face from them, but their eyes pressed upon her like stones. The platform emptied quickly. Wagons creaked away, boots shuffled back to warmth, and Clara remained with her case and her wounded pride. A life lived in shadows had taught her how swiftly people turned cold when disappointment entered the room. She thought of returning to the train, but its whistle was already fading, leaving her stranded. The air smelled of coal, smoke, and pine resin, and in it lay the hollow silence of nowhere to go. She stood small beneath the broad white sky, wishing the earth would swallow her. It was then she noticed the child, a little girl with a red ribbon tucked into her dark hair, gripping the rough hand of a tall man. He wore a coat worn thin at the elbows and boots, dusted with years of hard living. His face was carved by wind and grief, his eyes shadowed under the brim of his hat. He was waiting not for her but for a sack of flour and a coil of rope that rested near his boots. The girl tugged at him, then looked toward Clara with a solemn gaze far older than her years. Clara tried to look away, ashamed of her own desperation, but the girl's eyes held hers, as if seeing straight through. Then the child's lips moved, her whisper rising just enough to carry across the snow. "Papa, God finally answered our prayer." The words struck Clara's chest with both wonder and fear. The man stiffened, his jaw tightening as though struck by something invisible. He glanced at Clara, then down to his daughter, a storm of reluctance in his silence. Clara lowered her eyes, cheeks burning, knowing she was not the miracle they hoped for. Yet the girl's hope wrapped around her like fragile warmth, something she had not felt in years. Jonas Callahan spoke at last, his voice low and even, the sound of someone unused to company. "We best be going, Eliza." He lifted the flour onto his shoulder, gathered his rope, and turned toward the wagon, waiting outside the depot. The girl clung to his coat and pleaded softly, "Papa, she's cold." Clara did not move. Pride told her not to follow, but her body trembled with the wind cutting through her thin shawl. Jonas paused, shoulders tight, as if caught in a battle between duty and reluctance. At last, he spoke without looking at her. "You got someplace to be, Miss." Her lips parted, but no answer came. The truth was heavier than her case. She swallowed, eyes stinging, and shook her head. Jonas sighed, almost inaudible. He set his things on the wagon and gave her one measured glance. "Come on then, it ain't right standing out here in this." He offered no hand, but his silence carried a strange kind of mercy. Clara followed, her boots crunching against the snow, her case held like a shield. Eliza beamed, as if she had known all along, and climbed into the wagon's seat, patting the spot beside her. Clara hesitated before sitting, careful not to let her skirts brush against Jonas's worn coat. The horse stamped impatiently, breath misting the air, and Jonas flicked the reins. The wagon groaned into motion, wheels cutting a path through the drifts. The ride stretched long, the land rolling white and quiet under the pale moon. Trees bowed heavy with snow, fences leaned tiredly against the weight of weather. And all the while, Clara held her case on her lap as though it tethered her to something familiar. Eliza hummed a hymn, her voice soft and sure, and Clara found herself breathing in rhythm with it, each note settling into the hollowness inside her. Jonas said nothing, but every so often, his gaze flickered toward her with guarded curiosity before returning to the road. By the time they reached the ranch, night had deepened, stars scattered sharp across the sky. The house stood small against the wilderness, its roof patched, its porch boards sagging. But a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth. Clara felt like an intruder, stepping down from the wagon into snow that seemed untouched by any other stranger's feet. The door creaked open to a space worn by years of quiet survival, a rough-hewn table, a fire crackling low, and walls that carried silence more than sound. Jonas set his things aside, his movements precise, his back a shield against questions. Clara lingered near the doorway, clutching her case as though someone might push her back out into the night. Eliza pulled her toward the fire, her small hands surprisingly firm. "You can sit here," she said, with the authority of innocence. Clara lowered herself into the chair, the heat biting her frozen fingers until they ached with relief. Jonas set an extra plate on the table without comment. The scrape of the dish across the wood felt like a quiet invitation. Clara's eyes blurred for a moment, not from the smoke, but from the small mercy hidden in the gesture. She laid her gloves on her lap, folded neatly, as though proving her worth through tidiness. When Martha Whitfield, the seamstress from town, passed by the ranch the next morning, her sharp eyes caught sight of Clara through the window. By sundown, whispers threaded through the town like wildfire. Jonas Callahan brought home a stray bride. The weight of their judgment would soon settle heavy on Clara's shoulders, though for now she remained unaware, sitting by the fire with Eliza curled against her side, the girl's doll resting on Clara's lap. Jonas glanced once at the sight, his face unreadable, yet something in his posture eased, if only by a fraction, as though the long silence of his house had shifted. Clara closed her eyes, letting herself feel, if only for a fragile moment, the warmth of belonging. And though she knew this was not her intended stop, not the life she had expected, something inside whispered that perhaps the wrong place could hold the right beginning. Morning light spilled over the hills, like a thin wash of gold, but it did little to warm the air. Clara stood at the small window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched Jonas in the yard, splitting wood with a steady rhythm that seemed born of habit rather than strength. Each swing of the axe carried something more than necessity grief, perhaps, or a vow he refused to break. She had not asked, but she sensed the absence in the house, the way certain silences clung too tightly to the walls. Eliza's laughter filled the gaps, and still, behind every sound lingered a shadow. The town's whispers reached her sooner than she had expected. Martha Whitfield visited under the guise of delivering fabric scraps, her eyes sharp as needles as she took in the sight of Clara in Jonas's kitchen. "Didn't expect to find you here, dear," Martha said, her smile tight. Clara tried to thank her politely, but the words stuck. By the time Martha left, Clara knew her presence had already been weighed and found wanting in the town's court of gossip. Sheriff Dunbar confirmed it a few days later when he stopped by the ranch for coffee. He leaned back in his chair, thumbs hooked into his vest, and remarked casually, "A woman alone is vulnerable in these parts. Folks are wondering if you belong here." Clara felt the blood rise in her cheeks, but said nothing. Jonas's silence was steady as stone, yet she noticed his hand curl into a fist beneath the table. The sheriff finished his drink and left with a polite nod, leaving behind a heaviness that settled in Clara's chest. Eliza grew ill not long after, a winter fever that flushed her cheeks and kept her tossing in bed. Clara stayed by her side, cooling her forehead with damp cloths, humming lullabies she had carried from childhood. Jonas lingered in the doorway, watching, his face unreadable. One night, when Eliza's fever broke, he entered quietly, setting down a cup of broth. Their hands brushed in the exchange, a fleeting contact that startled them both more than it should have. Clara whispered thanks, and Jonas gave only a short nod, his gaze drifting to his daughter's sleeping form. The house felt less lonely that night, as though a crack of warmth had seeped into its bones. Yet Jonas fought against it. Clara could see the struggle in the way he avoided her eyes, the way he busied himself with endless chores. His late wife lingered between them, unspoken, a ghost neither dared disturb. For Clara, the shame of arriving unclaimed pressed against her daily. Every glance in town reminded her she was a mistake, a stray who had stepped off at the wrong stop and found herself caught in another man's story. Tobias Granger, the saloon owner, fanned the flames. He had a taste for cruelty dressed as humor. When Clara walked past the saloon one afternoon, his voice carried loud enough for the crowd to hear. That Callahan fella couldn't order a bride, so one just fell into his lap. Laughter followed, like spurs clinking. Clara lowered her gaze, quickening her steps, but the sting lingered long after Jonas heard of it. That evening, he came home later than usual, smelling of smoke and whiskey, though he had not touched a drop. His shoulders carried a burden heavier than firewood. He did not speak of it, but Clara sensed something had shifted. The next day, when Tobias pressed his taunts further at the saloon, Jonas finally broke his silence. He stood tall in the dim light, his voice carrying more weight than fists ever could. "You think yourself a man, mocking what you'll never understand. She belongs here more than you ever will." The room fell still. Tobias sneered, but the crowd did not laugh this time. Jonas left without looking back, his steps steady, as though a long decision had finally been made. When he returned home, Clara was by the fire, Eliza asleep across her lap, the child's small hand curled around the edge of Clara's skirt. Jonas stopped in the doorway, watching the sight. The firelight painted Clara's face in warmth, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes lowered in thought. She did not notice him at first. He crossed the room quietly, his boots barely whispering against the floor. In his hands he carried a quilt, worn but carefully kept, the colors faded by time. Without a word, he draped it over Clara's shoulders. The weight of the fabric startled her, but when she looked up, she saw not pity but something gentler in his eyes, perhaps, or the first fragile stirrings of belonging. She pressed a hand to the quilt, knowing it had once belonged to his wife, and the gesture cut deeper than any spoken vow. Jonas said nothing, only settled into the chair across from her, his gaze resting on his daughter's peaceful face. The silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like the beginning of something both were afraid to name. Winter stretched on, but the house no longer felt like a hollow place. Clara found herself tending to small corners, mending a torn curtain, placing wildflowers in a jar when the snow melted, filling the kitchen with soft hums as she worked. Jonas moved through his days with steadier steps, less burden in his shoulders, though his words remained sparse. It was not what Clara had dreamed of when she boarded the train, but it was real, and it was quietly becoming hers. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the land in shades of fire and ash, Clara stood outside with Jonas, the fields stretching endless before them. The air smelled of wood smoke and thawing earth. Eliza chased the last patches of snow, her laughter carrying across the yard like a hymn. Jonas cleared his throat, his voice low, almost uncertain. Sometimes, he said, a man don't get what he plans for. Sometimes, maybe that's a mercy. Clara looked at him, her breath catching. She wanted to answer, but words felt too fragile. Instead, she laid her hand against the quilt still draped around her shoulders. Jonas met her gaze, steady and unflinching, and for the first time, she did not see walls in his silence. She saw a door. The stars came out one by one, sharp and clear against the vast sky, and Clara felt the truth settle into her bones. She had stepped off at the wrong stop. Yes, but perhaps it was the only place her soul was meant to rest. And so, the old storyteller's voice lingers, speaking to you now as the fire dies low. Life will sometimes leave you stranded, unwanted, or judged by those who see only with shallow eyes. But do not curse the wrong turns, for it is often at the broken stops, the unexpected places, where grace waits with open hands. Remember this, dear listener, home is not always where you planned to go, but where mercy chooses to keep you. If this tale found a place in your heart, let it ride with you a while longer. Subscribe, and return to the fire, where more Wild West tales wait to keep you company through the long night.